Hello, everyone. This is Mark Hughes, missing all of you, speaking to you from my basement office, and very happy to welcome and recognize the fantastic work of a couple of Princeton colleagues, Eric Larson and Jesse Jenkins, who have somehow found the time to add us to their busy schedule to discuss a very important report that's already having lots of influence. Eric and Jesse are just up the road at the fantastic Andlinger Center for Energy and Environment at Princeton. I love any research institute that has on their homepage about the building, and it is a wonderful building indeed. This research is not only breakthrough research in the sense of how it is kind of plowed new ground around the deepest challenges of the energy transition, but it's more than just a breakthrough. It's also a blueprint, which takes extremely seriously the implementation requirements and strategies that could actually take these ideas and bring them into reality, which we are great admirers of that work and that approach. So thanks very much to both Eric and Jesse. Before I turn it over to them for some opening comments of 20 to 30 minutes to kind of share with you the broad outlines of the report, after which we'll have a Q&A. I just need to say a couple of things. First, we're recording this event and a slide presentation the slide presentation will be available in a day or two afterwards, as well as the video. Actually, it says here on our website tomorrow. Thank you, amazing Kleinman team. The Q&A will be found in the Q&A panel. Please try to avoid asking questions in chat. It's one less thing for us to monitor during the course of the questions and answers. We expect to already have a queue of questions coming in, so feel free to start to add questions during the presentation phase. And we'll take those in rough order, although I may package things in a way that can kind of lump some questions together. All right. And because there's not only two adept colleagues here, but because they've been pretty well practiced in the last 6 weeks or so, presenting and discussing this important report, they may be able to do a little tag team of kind of answering some clarifying questions in the Q&A while they're having the more substantive conversations live for the whole group. All right, so I think that's enough with the housekeeping. Let me turn it over to our guests for about, again, 20-25 minutes of presentation. Eric, Jesse, take it away.
Great, thank you, Mark. Let me see if I can share my screen here. All right. Are we seeing that?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. So this we're going to take, as Mark said, 20 or 30 minutes and just run through a high level overview of our study. It's 350 pages, so we're obviously going to skim over some things, but this was a 2-year study with 18 researchers, half at Princeton and the other half at various organizations collaborating with us. And we set out to answer the question of what pathways could take us as a country to net zero emissions by 2050, and what these imply for how energy gets used and energy gets supplied. And then beyond that, to ask what the implications are for things like jobs and health and economics. And we think that our study is pretty unique in the level of granularity that we've done analysis at. So we've made the changes that will come along with a net zero pathway quite visceral at a human scale, and helping to really quantify what the challenges and the opportunities are. And it lets us really think about the trade-offs that are involved for getting to net zero by different pathways. And as Mark mentioned, we end up with sort of a blueprint for how it could happen, but we don't offer any specific policy recommendations for how to make these changes, how to affect these changes. We wanted to open up a conversation by creating a clear picture of what needs to happen, and then let the debate go from there. So with that as a brief introduction, let me turn it over to Jesse to run through a few slides, and then I'll come back for some at the end.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks to the Kleinman Center for having us today. We love hanging out with you. I wish we could hang out in person, but thanks for joining us or inviting us for this virtual presentation and for helping us share this work with a broader audience. So we were focused in this study not on presenting our favorite path to net zero emissions or the optimal strategy to get to net zero emissions. Instead, we wanted to look at several different pathways that in some ways, not span the whole range of possibilities, but push several kind of more extreme examples of different routes we might take on our way to a net zero emissions America by 2050. So we built 5 different primary scenarios. We ran something like 45 additional sensitivity scenarios that you can find in the full report also, but these are the main 5 ones that we focus on because they present a core range of trade-offs across several different axes that are very important to examine. In addition to that, we also created a reference scenario, which is a no policy or no new policy scenario, similar to the annual energy outlook that the US Energy Information Administration or EIA puts out every year. And that's useful as a benchmark. It's not a prediction of what's likely to happen, but it's useful as a benchmark for what would happen potentially if we have no additional policy action going forward. And therefore we can isolate the differences between that pathway and the pathways that we need to go down if we want to reach net zero. And so would need additional policy action to drive these changes. And you can see that the reference case is pretty similar. This is our total primary energy supply for the United States economy. That by 2050, it's pretty similar as it is today, with some decline in coal, some increase in wind and solar, but a heavy reliance still on natural gas and oil in the reference scenarios. All of the net zero scenarios, by contrast, are quite a bit different. We have somewhere between a 50 and 75% roughly decline in the use of oil and natural gas. And coal is entirely phased out actually by 2030 in all of these scenarios as well. And a substantial increase in the role of renewable energy, particularly wind and solar and bioenergy. And in some scenarios, an increase in the role of nuclear power or natural gas with carbon capture and sequestration. So let me just briefly describe these 5 scenarios because they'll show up across the rest of our slides as well. And collectively, these 5 map across 3 main dimensions of differences. The first being the degree of electrification of end-use activities like vehicles and heating, space heating and water heating in buildings. With a high electrification scenario that involves almost complete saturation of those markets with electric options, and a less high scenario that pushes back the S-curve of adoption for most of those technologies by about a decade. And since that curve of adoption is nonlinear and accelerates over time, pushing it back by 10 years means that by 2050, we only have about 50, 55, 60% penetration levels in the vehicle and building stock for electric scenarios. So that's our E+ and E- scenario at the beginning there. We also explore variations in the role of bioenergy. So in 4 of these 5 scenarios, we limit the amount of biomass available for energy uses to avoid any conversion of lands that are currently devoted to agriculture or forestry or conservation into bioenergy production. So this is to limit the sustainability and food price impacts of a growing bioenergy sector. And so what that leaves us with is the current land that's devoted to growing corn for ethanol production, which is about 40% of all corn in the United States today, which is already going into energy purposes for ethanol. And then agricultural and forestry wastes that are, and some municipal solid waste that are harvested from across the country in a sustainable manner as well. And so you can see that allows a substantial increase in the overall role of bioenergy, the green bar here, from current levels to quite a substantial contribution of primary energy supply in all of the cases. In the low electrification scenario, the E- family of scenarios, because we're not electrifying as many buildings and vehicles, there's a greater demand for liquid and gaseous fuels, natural gas for heating our homes, transportation fuels from petroleum or other sources. And so one way to provide those fuels, that greater demand for fuel without carbon emissions or with carbon neutral outcomes, is to rely more heavily on biomass. So the middle scenario there then relaxes that restriction on bioenergy that's present in the other 4 cases. Or scenarios, and allows the full supply of bioenergy that might be available in the United States, as estimated by a US DOE and US Department of Energy report called the Billion Ton Study. So this is basically all the biomass we could get across the country, including conversion of some lands that are currently used today for forestry or agriculture into bioenergy production. So there's very different impacts in that scenario than the others. Then the final two scenarios are variants of our high electrification case, E+, and they basically push and pull on the role of wind and solar energy. So our RE- scenario constrains the growth of wind and solar so that we can only deploy about the same amount as we have historically, a maximum of about 35 gigawatts per year of wind and solar growth, which is the rate that we deployed in 2020. That limits then the role of wind and solar over time. And it's meant to be maybe perhaps an extreme example of a scenario where we can't accelerate the rate of additions of wind and solar beyond current levels, perhaps due to siting constraints and backlash around wind and solar siting impacts, or an inability to expand transmission at the rate required to support wind and solar growth, or the inability to scale up the workforce or mobilize capital and supply chains in that way. You can see the RE- case, if wind and solar play a smaller role, then that means we need a larger role for other carbon-free or low-carbon sources, which includes a substantial expansion of nuclear energy in orange, and a greater reliance on natural gas in gray, primarily for large stationary uses for hydrogen production and power generation with carbon capture and sequestration. Now, finally, in the RE+ scenario, we have a very different pathway in which we get 100% of primary energy from renewable sources by 2050. So this scenario, we prohibit the use of fossil fuels entirely. We require the phase out of nuclear power by 2050. And we also prohibit underground sequestration of CO2. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no capture of carbon in this scenario, because we have to displace fossil fuels for liquids and gaseous fuel demand, in this case still, for all those fuels we don't electrify. We still need to capture about 700 million metric tons, or 0.7 gigatons of carbon each year from biomass and direct air capture, which is taking carbon out of the atmosphere and then making that available to use in carbon neutral fuels. And we'll talk a bit more about that later on. The other scenarios all capture larger amounts of CO2 and primarily sequester that CO2 underground. And we'll talk about that also later in the slides. So this gives you a sense of the range of different scenarios that we looked at. They're not probably every path that's possible. And in fact, the path that we go down as a country is unlikely to be any of these specific pathways, but it gives us a chance to explore some key axes of uncertainty or differences, which generate very different trade-offs in the long term. Next slide. There we go. One of the important findings of the study is that all of these pathways, which rely only on technologies that we basically know the engineering of, have demonstrated at pilot or commercial scale, or are in commercial use today, they're all feasible transitions, and they're all affordable transitions to net zero emissions across the US economy. What we find is that historically, in times outside of recessions or oil price shocks, we spent on the order of 5 to 8% of our GDP on energy services. So our household bills, our business expenditures, about 5 to 8% of that in total goes to the energy services we need to power our lives and our economy. In times of recession or in oil price shocks, that can skyrocket to 10 or even 14% of our GDP during the late 1970s and 80s. But in times when we're a prosperous society as a country, we've spent between 5 and 8% of our GDP on energy services. And what we find is that across all of these scenarios to net zero, we spend a similar magnitude of our GDP, perhaps lower even than historical levels, on energy services. So this is an important finding that we would not have seen if we did this study 10 years ago, and is due to the substantial declines in the cost of wind and solar and electric vehicles and their batteries, and improvements that we would expect to continue over time in a range of technologies. And what that means is that we are now to a point where we can make an affordable transition to a net zero emissions economy. Some of the scenarios cost more than others, but all of them are within this range of 4 to 6% of GDP spent on energy services, which is quite similar to historical levels or today's levels. In addition, we do show that this is more expensive than the reference or frozen policy scenario, in which we don't make any transition towards net zero. It's about 3% more expensive, or about 300 billion in net present value terms over the next decade through 2030. But it's worth pointing out that we freeze the oil prices and oil and gas prices at the same level at a low oil and gas trajectory for all of these cases, including the reference case, where we consume a lot more oil and gas in the United States in that scenario relative to the net zero transition pathways. And so one would expect that the reference case might have higher oil and gas prices, all else equal, than those net zero scenarios. And if that's the case, or if we hit another oil price shock along the way, this gap between the reference scenarios and our net zero pathways could actually disappear entirely. So that's important to note that not only are we transitioning to net zero in an affordable manner, we're also insulating the US economy from historical exposure to oil price volatility and external commodity price shocks, which have had dramatic ramifications for the US economy in the past and would no longer be a substantial threat in a net zero emissions economy. Next slide. We also find that all of these pathways, while they use them to differing degrees, they all rely on the same 6 key pillars of decarbonization. So these are our essential building blocks of a net zero emissions economy. You really can't take any of these pillars out entirely or the whole building falls down. And so we can, there are some trade-offs about how much we rely on any one of these scenarios and that, or any one of these pillars, and that's what our 5 scenarios are meant to capture. But all 6 of these building blocks are present in all of the pathways that we explored. The first is end-use energy efficiency and electrification. Energy efficiency can reduce the overall amount of energy services we need, and therefore the amount, or energy supply we need, and therefore the amount of supply-side infrastructure. And electrification can both contribute to efficiency and can shift more of our energy use away from liquid and gaseous fuels and onto electricity, which is much easier for us to decarbonize. We have many more substitutes for carbon-free electricity. So then the second component is to clean the electricity supply. We need to not only eliminate all CO2 emissions that come from the power sector, but also to dramatically expand the role of electricity in the economy as we electrify buildings and transportation and industrial processes, as well as produce hydrogen. And so that means a major role for wind and solar generation, expansion of transmission, and a reliance on firm power resources, which are technologies that are available on demand for as long as needed any time of the year, and therefore are really critical complements to weather-dependent resources like wind and solar, or shorter duration, energy-limited resources like batteries. Third, we're going to electrify a lot, but the things that we don't electrify will still mean there's demand for liquid and gaseous fuels, and we're going to need to meet those demands in ways that are carbon neutral. And that relies on the third pillar, which is bioenergy and other zero carbon fuels and feedstocks, including hydrogen production. The fourth is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. As I mentioned before, all 5 scenarios use substantial amounts of carbon capture, and then some combination of either utilization and storage, geologic storage of CO2. The fifth piece is a reduction in non-CO2 greenhouse gases. So the first 4 really focus on cutting carbon emissions, but there are other potent greenhouse gases like methane, refrigerants like HFCs, and nitrous oxides from agriculture that also need to be reduced as much as is possible. That's unlikely we can get them all the way to 0 because there'll still be agriculture-related emissions, but we need to reduce these as much as we can. And then 6th, we need to enhance and protect the land carbon sinks across the United States. That includes uptake of carbon and storage in soils, in agriculture, and in forests. And so we need to enhance and protect those land carbon sinks, and those will help offset in the net balance some of the residual emissions of non-CO2 greenhouse gases across the economy. Next slide. So because we use these building blocks to differing degrees, what becomes apparent when we look across different implementation challenges and different trade-offs is that all of these pathways involve very significant challenges. So they're affordable pathways, but that doesn't mean they're easy. And they involve a variety of different challenges. Here we've mapped out several different implementation challenges, and there are probably several more. And what you can see at the beginning here is that, and we've basically put them in order of how challenging each pathway is along each of these axes. What you can see is that none of these scenarios clearly dominates all of the others on every challenge axis. What that means is that we need to think about these trade-offs very clearly. These are the key differentiating factors between these scenarios. And there's no single best strategy here, right? All of these involve significant challenges. So greater degrees of electrification, getting consumers to adopt electric vehicles, how much wind and solar or transmission can we deploy? How quickly can we mobilize labor or capital? How much can we rely on nuclear or bioenergy or CO2 storage, et cetera? And so each of these scenarios offers very different implementation challenges on these different axes. And ultimately, these differentiations, rather than cost, most likely, are what's going to determine ultimately which pathway society wants to go down. And also, we should note that many of these challenges are kind of threshold challenges, or not, are cumulative challenges, where the first progression down that path is relatively easy, but the cumulative impacts mount and the challenges get harder as we go. And that means that it's important from a risk management perspective to keep as many of these pathways open as real options for the country as we go down the path to net zero. so that if we run into a barrier on any one of these paths, we have multiple ways in which we could tack in a different direction, address a different set of challenges, and continue to make progress on our way to net zero. So that's a key takeaway from this trade-off space as well. Next slide. So I'll zoom in now on the electricity sector, and then I'll hand things over to Eric to finish out a summary of some of the other pillars. And I want to emphasize here that solar and wind are cornerstones for each of our pathways to net zero, as well as end-use electrification, which you can see here in the more than doubling of total electricity generation across all of these pathways. You can click again, Eric. By 2030, all of the paths follow a pretty similar pace, except for the case where we explicitly constrain the growth of wind and solar. And that means deploying on the order of 550 to 600 gigawatts of new solar and wind capacity over the next decade, enough to bring solar and wind's share of our annual electricity supply from about 10% today to about half by mid-century or by 2030. And then they would grow, continue to grow from there quite substantially through 2050. To deploy that amount of solar means we have to be building on average 55 to 60 gigawatts per year over the next 10 years, which compares to about 35 gigawatts as a historical peak rate that was achieved in 2020. In other words, we have to continue to accelerate the pace at which we deploy wind and solar to be on this track, and roughly double the annual rate of deployment by the end of the decade. Now, if we constrain the growth of wind and solar, or we are unable to expand and accelerate that rapidly, as we see in the RE- case, then we need to prepare ourselves for a substantial expansion of nuclear and gas with carbon capture or other clean, firm generating technologies that like advanced geothermal that could step in and fill the gap left by a more diminished role for wind and solar. Even then, wind and solar grow substantially through 2030 and become about 40% of our much larger energy supply mix by 2050. So there's no scenario here where wind and solar growth isn't substantial. The final thing I'll point on this slide is that all of these pathways maintain the existing nuclear power fleet wherever it is safe to continue operating. There's going to be no cheaper source of new clean, firm generating capacity or carbon-free energy than maintaining our existing fleet of nuclear power plants wherever it is safe to continue operating them. And so as a scenario assumption here, and this could be higher or lower, we assume that in all these cases, about 2/3 of the existing nuclear fleet could continue operating through 80 years. And it could certainly be more or less than that, depending on policy and safety reviews on a case-by-case basis. Next slide. This is one of the examples of how we've moved beyond the sort of modeling, high-level modeling results that you saw in the last slide, which you've probably seen in a bunch of other studies, these sort of high-level graphics, to really try to look at not just what the aggregate outcomes are for the country, but specific outcomes for specific places and communities and states across the United States. So here you can see our existing wind and solar capacity mapped across the United States. We have about 150 gigawatts of wind and about 70 gigawatts of solar. And you can see the spatial extent of wind deployment in dark blue. And if you look really closely there are some orange PV systems, large-scale PV projects in California and Arizona and elsewhere that are difficult to see at this level. You can also see the high voltage transmission system in gray and our urban demand centers as well on this map. So this is our current status in 2020, at the end of 2020, if you click again. And this is where we may end up needing to be by 2050. With roughly 1,500 gigawatts or 1.5 terawatts of wind and solar capacity by the end of the transition by mid-century. Each 1.5 terawatts each of wind and solar capacity. And you can see the spatial extent is quite significant, particularly for wind, but also for solar, as you can see in a large part of the country. The substantial offshore wind build out in the Northeast, huge build outs in the center of the country for wind, solar across much of the US, close to demand centers in particular, and a major expansion of transmission to support this growth of wind and solar resources, roughly tripling our overall transmission capacity between now and 2050. And you can see some of the routes that would need to be expanded to move energy from where it might be generated here into our urban centers. Now, this is one of several ways in which that deployment could unfold, but this is one lowest cost strategy that involves a comprehensive screening of all available sites across the country for where we could build wind and solar capacity. And then we try to site that at a lowest cost in order to meet the required model demand. So this is an example of what we call downscaling our results from high-level modeling results to a much more geospatially refined and visceral sense of scale, right? This is what it might look like across the US landscape as we deploy wind and solar. And that allows us to do quite a bit of additional analysis on land use impacts, on employment associated with this deployment of technologies, and other sorts of analyses as well. And I'll hand it over to Eric now. Oh, sorry, one more slide. Thanks, Eric. So I do want to stress that while wind and solar play the dominant role in terms of energy supply across most of these scenarios, we also need to complement these weather-dependent resources with both shorter duration battery storage, which is the purple wedge here, but also with firm generating capacity. So this is the capacity or maximum generating capability of these resources rather than the annual energy, which we showed you earlier. And we have about 850 or 900 gigawatts of firm capacity in the US today, which is mostly from fossil-fired power plants, gas and coal, with about 100 gigawatts from nuclear. Over all of our scenarios and all modeled years, we need to maintain on the order of 500 to 1,000 gigawatts of firm capacity to maintain reliability and support the weather-dependent variable resources in a cost-effective way. A lot of that capacity comes from converting natural gas and coal plants, natural gas combined cycle and combustion turbine plants to running on higher and higher hydrogen blends by 2050 to reduce their carbon intensity, but also from contributions of biomass and natural gas plants with CCS and nuclear power, particularly in the RE- case where they expand much more substantially. All right, now it's over to you, Eric. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jesse. I'm going to talk a bit about the fuel side of the picture and wrap up with some of the impacts on jobs and health. So this is another example of the downscaling that Jesse mentioned. This is what we envision the biomass energy industry to be looking like by 2050 in the scenario where we constrain the biomass quantities to the amount that would not lead to any land use change relative to current land uses. And that includes the possibility of converting land that is currently used for corn ethanol production, but converting that to more sustainable and perennial energy grasses, for example, and higher yield. And so the forest residues and crop residues supplies in this analysis is based on the billion-ton study from the Department of Energy and USDA that many of you are probably familiar with. So what this map shows is on a 100-mile by 100-mile square, the availability of biomass in quantities that are in proportion to the size of the circles, and the colors represent different technologies that would be converting that biomass into different energy products. And we picked the 100-mile by 100-mile resolution, which is backed behind the 100-mile by 100-mile is county level resource data. And the limitation on the size of the grid cell was due to the fact that biomass is pretty expensive to transport around. And so most of it's likely to be used near where it's produced. And what jumps out at you, and a couple things jump out at us from this map. There are a lot of circles suggesting that biomass is a very significant part of the energy system by 2050. And indeed, it's about 20% of primary energy. The light green color represents hydrogen production from biomass with CO2 capture. And that's a technology that finds high value in our scenarios because it provides a carbon-free fuel, hydrogen, but it's actually carbon negative because we've captured biomass carbon that came recently from the atmosphere, and we're going to put that below ground in sequestration sites. And I'll talk more about sequestration in another slide. So this is quite a transformation of the rural biomass industry that exists today, and quite an expansion relative to that. On CO2 capture and utilization and storage, this is a summary that shows in 2050, the sources of CO2, that is where CO2 is being captured in our scenarios, and then where it's being used or sequestered in the lower panel. And you can see that there's substantial amounts of CO2 capture and storage in all of this. In all of the scenarios, there's CO2 capture. In 4 of them, there's significant storage. The fifth scenario, the one on the right, the RE plus, that's the case where we constrained to no use of fossil fuels by 2050. And so all of the CO2 that's captured in that scenario is turned back into synthetic liquids to run as fuels. And you can see the biomass, the light green biomass hydrogen is a big source. You can see in the 1E- scenario, direct air capture becomes quite an important, that's the dark purple, becomes quite an important source of capturing CO2, because in that particular scenario, we haven't electrified the vehicle fleet as aggressively. And so we need to compensate for additional emissions by extracting carbon from the air and putting it below ground. So as a whole, between 1 and almost 2 gigatons per year of CO2 are being captured and stored. And to put that number in, those numbers in perspective, a gigaton per year of CO2 is about 30% more on a volume basis than the current oil production for the US in total. So it's a substantial CO2 capture and storage industry that develops. And this is a 2050 vision of what the pipeline network might look like that would enable us to do this. You can see all the point sources of CO2 with spur lines connecting into trunk lines that then carry the CO2 to the gray shaded areas, which are prospective storage basins around the US. And it's worth, you can see the thick lines of the trunk lines running from the Midwest down into the Texas, Louisiana region. 3/4 of the CO2 storage capacity is, we estimate, is in that Texas, Louisiana Gulf Coast region. So a lot of the CO2 is going to end up stored there. So this is another way of looking at the impacts of these scenarios. And if we're successful with these transitions, these are the kinds of impacts that we'll be living with in 2050 and beyond. And in this case, I've added CO2 pipelines and high voltage transmission lines together in the metric that's called added pipes and wires. And you can see that in the RE plus, that blue scenario, will have the highest impact in terms of length of pipelines and wires. Other scenarios have greater land use or less land use. We have jobs and health benefits, which I'll talk about of varying degrees in the scenarios. So there's trade-offs that ultimately we'll be living with as if we are successful along any of these pathways. We built a model to look at what the change in energy-related jobs would be under our scenarios, and this is a high-level summary at a state-by-state level. The coloring represents change. Green represents an increase over the decade of 15% or more. The yellow represents plus or minus 15%, roughly staying constant, and red represents a decrease of more than 15% in that decade. And you can see that across most states, you see a lot of green. So jobs are increasing. A lot of those are in construction and professional services that go along with all of the construction that's going on in these scenarios. There are a couple of notable places where employment decreases. West Virginia in particular stands out as a result of the coal industry. Coal-fired power plants shutting down over the first decade of this transition. There are job losses there, but those anticipating those kinds of changes, it's possible to have a different outcome than what we've shown here with good policy. For example, bringing in manufacturing jobs that related to solar and wind that are expanding during this time frame. And we have the employment results are broken out by in our larger report by economic sector, by resource sector, and other education level and so on. So a lot of detail there. Health impacts. This shows the air pollution related premature mortalities at a county level, currently from coal plant emissions, and from motor vehicle emissions. And in essentially all of our scenarios, we'll get to a picture that looks something like this in 2050. We will have avoided 200 to 300,000 premature deaths through 2050. or an equivalent of $2 to $3 trillion in damages. We've not modeled to date. We haven't modeled other health impacts like morbidity, but the premature mortalities alone is significant. And just as a sort of a final slide that says, what do we need to do in this next decade to get going? This is a snapshot of what we estimate to be the capital spending, $2.5 trillion beyond business as usual capital spending over the next decade to get us on one of these pathways to net zero. And as Jesse alluded to in the electricity discussion, the next decade is quite similar, regardless of which path we follow in the long term. So the investments that are made here and can be viewed as likely to be to return value in the long term. So it's we can be pretty confident going forward with a program that elicits this kind of capital mobilization. Solar and wind is a big chunk of it on the left, dark blue there. Networks, including transmission and CO2, the CO2 transportation system. On the consumer side, buildings and appliances in the dark red or brown. There are extra costs associated with building shell retrofits, with heat pumps, replacing furnaces, and so on, as well as light duty vehicles. Electric vehicles are reach parity in our modeling, reach parity on a first cost basis with conventional vehicles around 2030. So there's a premium there. And then on the right-hand side of this, we see in the industrial sector, productivity improvements need to proceed there, and those are the biggest chunk of the projected capital there. And then finally, in the bottom right, we have this option creation box, which refers to technologies that we have an understanding of on an engineering basis today, but which are not ready for widespread deployment yet. And in order to prepare them to be deployed in the 2030s and 2040s, as our scenarios would want them to be, we need to invest in some demonstrations and development to make them those kinds of technologies ready for widespread deployment. And those are things like advanced nuclear, direct air capture, biomass gasification for hydrogen production, and several others that we itemize in our report. Overall, that option creation is a relatively modest part of the total capital spending that we need to mobilize. And it's important to point out this is both private and public sector capital. So in fact, most of it is likely to be private sector capital. And the trick will be to figure out how we mobilize this kind of spending, which is not traditionally the way we have done spending in the energy system. So with that, I'll stop my sharing and we can open it up for discussion, Mark.
That's terrific. Thank you guys both very much. Fantastic. Fantastic presentation, and even I have to note, I don't know sure if everyone can see this, but you've already answered 29 of the almost 50 questions that have been queued up for you. So thanks very much for that. What I'll try to do now with the 20, now 30 remaining questions that are open is gather them into some kind of bundles for you to discuss. And let me start. Actually, this is one that's come up a little bit in some of the comments and questions, but I want to put a particular frame on it, which is I really appreciate the way you kind of recognize, but also set out the kind of the robustness criterion for the actual practice of the decision making, right? That these scenarios can inform. That is that, kind of keep maintaining optionality until the particular future that we will eventually face does unfold. And I think I would have known the answer to this question, but for the fact that you do have that general scenario assumption about preserving a fraction of the nuclear fleet, right? So let me ask it more just in an open way. What's your intuition about the first significant fork among the pathways? If the first decade is roughly consistent across all of them? What's your intuition about the first big fork that we will face, and how we might anticipate that with some earlier investment or decision making?
Great question. Eric, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. Okay. This is a question that we haven't had before, so it's a good one.
Nice job, Mark.
So for me, I would say, and the reason, sort of the way we think about our report is a benchmarking tool, so we can see how far along we are in progress. And I think key benchmarks are going to be penetration of electric vehicles, and I would say build out of solar and wind. How fast those two things proceed in the first decade, I think we'll have a pretty clear idea by the third quarter of the decade whether we're starting to see a branch point. That would be my off the top of. Jesse, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think those are the two big ones, right? Because that's where the bulk of the capital would be invested this decade, right? Is in wind and solar and transmission to support that, and in electric vehicles and heat pump adoption in buildings. And so if we're lagging behind on any of those fronts, then we're sort of moving from the E plus type direction, which is the lowest cost, least constrained kind of pathway, into some of the other, avenues, right? So if electrification is slower, we're moving towards the E minus family of cases. If wind and solar growth is slower, we're moving towards the RE minus family of cases. So I think that's the main one. Most of the other technologies that are important, that fork us down the road after 2030 don't appear until later on. So, are we going to be able to expand bioenergy by how much? Are we going to be able to produce hydrogen from various sources, and how does that play out? How much carbon capture and sequestration can we do? But there are a lot of things that should be done this decade to make sure all of those are real options. And so the other fork that could happen is if we don't lay the foundations for those options now, then they won't be options in 2030, right? The way our model selects. So we'll be not only sort of seeing which path we go down, but we're also going to see which ones we're inadvertently cutting off by not making proactive investment. And that'll be another key benchmark to look at. So as an example, if we don't start now in getting a much better sense of where we can inject carbon dioxide safely and rapidly, which is how determines how many wells you need to drill to put a gigaton underground, and therefore the cost. So if we don't map our basins in a national effort to really understand that, if we don't start to plan out a national CO2 pipeline system of some sort, and get that rolling over the next decade, it's not going to be possible to scale CO2 capture to the levels that are needed in these scenarios later. And so that's one of those actions that has to happen now. And there's a development of a whole range of other advanced technologies that are, again, as Eric said, we know how to do them from an engineering perspective, like hydrogen production or biomass gasification or others, but they're more costly, more execution risk, higher, less mature technologies today than we want them to be by 2030 or 2035 to get us all the way to net zero. So that's the option creation type of investments that are just as important. And it's less of the total spending because they're, less projects and less to invest in, but critical investments to make now. And I sort of think about this the same way. If you look back at the history of wind and solar or electric vehicle batteries, if you go back just 10 years ago to the last time we had a significant policy opportunity at the federal level for energy and climate policy, wind power has fallen in price by 70% since that point, solar by 90%, electric vehicle batteries by almost 90%. These are transformative changes that have taken these technologies from being more expensive, less mature, higher execution risk, less attractive technologies to, what we called alternative energy at that point, to mainstream options, right? That have, trillions of dollars of global investment heading towards them. And so I think, we know we can do this. We've done it with wind and solar, batteries, fracking before that, not a clean technology, but another example of this type of innovation. And so we have to be laying the groundwork for the next set of energy technologies as well. So deploy what we have in the toolkit, and know how to do now, and also expand that toolkit as much as possible to keep all those options as real options, not just something that shows up in a model as a kind of fantasy sci-fi solution.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. Both of those answers are so great. And I know this is not why you're taking this approach. You're taking this approach because you are trying to do decision support research, but that kind of guarantees the legs of this report and this larger project. I mean, the fact that, your tools convert decision making from an event into a process, especially a process over decades, makes the kinds of mileposts and feedback that you guys have such a great handle on so critical. It's terrific. So here's a bundle of questions that did come up from the audience that I'm sure you have heard before, and recognizing that, you know, you guys are very smartly at this stage of the work trying to recede the specific policy mechanisms and any implicit recommendations that might come from that, and for later work, there's still lots of questions about carbon pricing, right? And so, you know, Arthur came up with a version of it, you know, implicitly on environmental costs, which you guys have come up with. Andy talked about a version of it. It is always the first answer to the question, you know, if you could do one thing, what would you do, and so on. And the thing I'm interested in it is less about the carbon pricing per se, the explicit, say, a tax or something, and more about, as the global conversation, especially related to increasing the ambition of Paris, starts to turn to kind of alternative mechanisms, like in particular a climate club, right, where kind of the price of admission has to do with some threshold level of carbon pricing in order to avoid the border adjustment mechanisms and so on, belong to the virtuous club. You know, there's these interesting ideas starting to emerge about, could green industrial policy or kind of massive public-private investment along the lines that you guys are modeling out here could somehow substitute for, be converted, right, into an implicit carbon pricing that would, in this context, make you eligible to join the club. Have you guys started thinking about, because I know you may not be publishing your policy recommendations yet around some mechanisms, but I know you guys are thinking about them. And as any of this kind of either the carbon pricing conversation or some of the stuff related to the clubs and, you know, spending versus taxing come up yet in your work?
Go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, so we were very purposeful in trying to avoid those discussions in this report. So as you know, co-authors of this report, we try to steer clear of that because we recognize there are many different ways to skin the cat or make progress on these fronts. And so carbon pricing is one of them. Subsidies for clean energy clearly are things that most countries in the world are doing and are working to drive technological change and industrial transformation and carbon reductions. Regulatory standards are important, right? You know, you think about CAFE standards for vehicles or the zero emissions vehicle standards that states like California put in place, which, you know, sort of responsible for Tesla's boom, right? You know, wouldn't exist without being able to sell ZEV, you know, credits, zero emissions vehicle credits to other automakers that aren't selling as many EVs as they are. You know, so there's a whole bunch of regulatory, you know, tools and incentives and penalties that have to be deployed. And so, you know, as Eric said, that $2.5 trillion area plot is our to-do list, right? So you need some policy that hits all of those boxes. And it could be one big policy, like a giant carbon price that does all of it. Or I think probably more realistically, given the political economy constraints, and you can read my working paper for the Kleinman Center that I've put out on this, you know, it's unlikely we're going to drive all of this change with a uniform economy-wide carbon price, right? I don't think there's any examples in the world of any country doing that, and that's for a reason. And so I think we have to think about, you know, there's some role for carbon pricing. It can play a major role in some sectors, a smaller role in others, maybe a zero role in the near term and a bigger role going forward. You know, we don't know, but some policy has to hit all of those boxes. And so, you know, I am heartened by the, you know, so the recent mantra of the Biden administration of a whole of government approach, because it really does take a whole bunch of different levers to do that, to touch all of these different boxes and make sure that there's some inducement to move off of this frozen policy case onto that $2.5 trillion investment path. And I'll just give one last plug, which is that separately from this report, Steve Picalo is one of the co-authors and myself have been members of a National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine expert committee that has been working over the last 12 months as well on policy recommendations and other, you know, information on how to accelerate decarbonization in the United States. And we're releasing that report next Tuesday. So it'll be a public webinar you can find on the National Academy site, and a major report that, you know, builds on a lot of the information in the Net Zero America study and others like it to show what we need to do, but also has substantial chapters on what the consensus committee, so these are not Princeton's view, not, you know, the Net Zero America studies view, but 18 or so of us that worked on this committee's sense of recommendations for how the US could do this. And it's a long list of policies. So carbon pricing is on the list, but it's, you know, I think we have a summary table in there that's like 5 pages long of policies, right? So I think that's the approach, right? You need a whole lot of different mechanisms to get us on this path, and carbon pricing is a useful tool, but by no means the only tool. And, you know, you can kind of see that in the carbon prices that would be needed in our report to get on this path that grow to be several $100s per ton. to do all the work on their own. And so it's, I think that's pretty unlikely from a political economy perspective, but if we could do it, it would be one way to get the job done.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I can tell it's not the first time you have been asked that one. So that was good. So let me ask you, here's a question from that Angela logged in very early in the presentation, which is related to kind of the jobs production, right? Some of those estimates about jobs. And do you constrain any of the supply chain considerations? Because, given kind of the current global deployment, right, of a lot of the say the solar or other supply chains on some of the jobs that would be generated by the transition. How's that handled inside the model?
So in the model, what we've assumed is that manufacturing of solar and wind would stay in the proportion would stay as it is today. So so I think it's 11% or something of solar is manufactured in the US. We keep that percentage going forward, and it's like 70%, I think, on wind. So we just fix that. But of course, that could change with policy. But we didn't have any way to guess what it might happen. So we just kept it constant.
Right. And how about on some of the land use stuff? We have several questions related to some of the land use coverage and so on. For example, a couple of my colleagues in design have asked about, for example, do you anticipate changes in the yields that are attributable to climate change, especially over this kind of look out to mid-century? Are there any kind of environmental justice considerations in any of the kind of the downscaling that you've looked again? Basically, at this point, just are these any constraints built into how you kind of make these estimates?
So yeah, I'll start, and then Jesse, you can. We have not. This is a least cost modeling exercise. We think that those kinds of issues that you're talking about are ultimately what's going to make or break whether we have success with any kind of scenario. So least cost is not what we really want to do, but we're starting to think about how we can incorporate some of those kinds of factors into the modeling longer term.
Yeah, I mean, one of the main motivations for doing this sort of detailed downscaling of all the results across every sector to a much more human, local, tangible scale is to try to develop tools that actually can provide some guidance on those questions about impacts on land use, on, forest, what's going to happen to our forest lands, what's going to happen to our agricultural lands, what does this mean for air pollution in specific localities, what does this mean for economic transitions in specific communities? And unless you can go from this big aggregate modeling down to the local scale, you can't really answer those questions. And so, this is a first attempt. We constructed these 5 paths to be sort of, span a range of trade-offs, not the only important ones, but a range of trade-offs. And then within the constraints that we use to create those scenarios, they're all lowest cost ways to meet the net zero goal given those constraints. So we get to a sense of the initial trade-off space, but there's much more work to be done to think about non-cost related objectives that could change the way we want to have this pathway unfold, and probably will change it and dictate that in the long term. So a major priority for us in the next phase of research at the Andlinger Center and with this group is to use the tools we've developed to more directly explore those trade-offs, and to, instead of citing everything around lowest cost, do multiple objectives at once and try to figure out what that trade-off space looks like. Because in many cases there are sort of flat trade-offs, right, where you can make a lot of progress on one objective without sacrificing much on cost or another objective. And there are others where it's quite steep, and revealing that information is really important for decision making, and revealing it not just at a national scale, but at a local scale as fine-grained as we can. So that's really where I think a lot of the direction of research for this kind of macro scale energy system modeling and decision support needs to head, and where we're really excited to dive into more with these tools, because this is really just a first pass to try to get down to that scale where we can actually start to get into these questions, again, from a quantitative rigorous standpoint, right? But so it's still decision support. We're not saying what should be done, but we can help reveal these trade-offs and provide a lot richer range of information for decision making at a tangible scale.
That's great. But maybe one last bundle of questions, given the time we have left, and also try to stay inside the least cost analysis approach. There's several questions related to aspects of storage, both kind of how you model it in some specific ways, but also I think one of the more interesting repeated asked questions is the trade-off between storage and transmission, co-located storage and transmission, and how, you know, what you've looked at in that regard, and you know, what the model reveals about, because you've got a lot of kind of transmission, and both on the electricity side and potentially, you know, on the hydrogen side as well. So did you think about the co-location aspects and the more generally storage aspects of? I'm sure you did.
Yeah, this model is at a not at a scale that lets us really get into like specific, you know, where on what transmission line do you put, you know, the storage. We do see that storage grows a lot from today's levels. It's on the order of a couple hundred gigawatts, 150 to 200 gigawatts by 2030, up from, you know, less than one today. So it's a big growth. It just doesn't, you know, people often miss it on the chart because it's, you know, it's not the 1.5 terawatts of wind or solar that's built. And so, you know, in comparison, it looks small. It's sort of an order of magnitude smaller. So storage definitely plays a key role in all these, both battery storage and then hydrogen, you know, and in the broader economy, you know, acts as a new fuel, just like natural gas or coal today, that can be stored and used on demand, including for power generation. The role of batteries, we also find, directly trades off with and competes with the demand flexibility. So we assume in the modeling, the baseline modeling, that about half of electric vehicles will be able to move around when they charge at any given night or day. And a good chunk of our hot water heating demand can also be shifted around. And when we increase or decrease that demand flexibility, we see a corresponding decrease or increase, the opposite, in storage, in battery storage. So, and I've seen this in other modeling I've done in the power sector. And it's just why I classify both of the technologies as balancing or fast burst resources that are good at, you know, meeting demand flexibility needs within the day on the order of a few hours. And so the more demand flexibility we have, the less batteries we need, and vice versa. And you are right that there is a trade-off, in other studies that are more granular have seen this around storage and transmission, right? Because we have the option of moving energy around in space, or we can use storage to move it around in time. And there is some substitution there. So in a scenario where we can't build as much transmission, you may need more storage, or more firm generation that can just produce power when it's needed, where it's needed, and not be so location dependent. So some combination of storage and firm generation are the sort of substitutes for large transmission build outs as well. So that's the kind of trade-off space that's created in the power sector.
The other, if I have time, the other element that comes in here is hydrogen, and the variability in the sun and the wind is handled on long time scales by turning on and off hydrogen production by electrolysis. We also have electric boilers, redundant electric boilers in the industrial sector, which are relatively cheap. And when electricity is cheap from the sun or the wind, you turn them on and don't use fuel. So those provide you additional flexibility to deal with the variability on the supply side. So that's a different scale of storage, if you will.
Right. Terrific. Very helpful. Thank you so much. We're out of time, I'm afraid. Sorry to the audience for questions I didn't get to. And thank you so much to both Eric and Jesse. Fantastic presentation, such an important report. We really appreciate the time that you've spent with us today. I don't know if I'm going to clap for everybody.
Virtual applause, yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks, Mark.
virtual applause for everyone. It's really wonderful. And as we mentioned at the top, the slide presentation and the recording will be available on the Kleinman Center website tomorrow. If you'd like to join us for our next virtual lecture, it'll be a conversation with Leah Stokes, and Leah will talk some excerpts from her very provocative new book, Short Circuiting Policy, and you'll see that also on our web page for the time and date. Location is where it always is, virtual. And if you're also interested in a non-Zoom channel, please join us for the our upcoming podcast on from Energy Policy Now, which again you can find on our website. And actually, we managed just this week to drop our one on Janet Yellen on the day she was appointed. So So I don't know what Andy's got in store for us next week, but actually I do, but you'll find it on the webpage. Thank you guys. It was really, really very helpful. Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
And thanks for all the great questions.
it. Sure. Pleasure.
All right, take care. Be safe.
Bye-bye. Yep, you too.